James Whitaker, an 82-year-old retired school principal, enjoyed his evening walks in the neighborhood park. It was a peaceful ritual, one that helped him reflect on life and stay active despite his age. That evening the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the pavement as James strolled along with his wooden cane tapping against the sidewalk. James had lived in this city for over 5 decades. He had seen it change, some things for the better, others for the worse. Despite everything, he had always carried himself with dignity, believing that respect was earned through one's actions, not dictated by assumptions. As he walked past the playground, he noticed a police cruiser slowing down. Something about the way it crept alongside him made his stomach tighten. He sighed, already having a bad feeling about what was coming next. The car came to a stop, and 2 officers, Detectives Ryan Blake and Kyle Peterson, stepped out. Their faces were set in that rigid, unreadable expression James had grown all too familiar with over the years, the kind that carried an air of authority mixed with unwarranted suspicion. "Hey, old man," Officer Blake called out. "What are you doing around here?" James tightened his grip on his cane but kept his voice calm. "Taking my usual walk. Is there a problem, officer?" Officer Peterson crossed his arms, his eyes scanning James up and down. "We got a report about a suspicious person loitering in the area," he said. "You match the description." James raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? At my age? Don't get smart with us," Blake snapped. "We need to see some ID." James sighed. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew better than to argue. He reached into his coat pocket to retrieve his wallet, but before he could even pull it out, Officer Peterson grabbed his wrist. "Slow down," Peterson warned. "You making any sudden moves on purpose?" James frowned, his patience wearing thin. "I'm just getting my ID like you asked." Blake smirked. "Just making sure. You people tend to get feisty when questioned." James inhaled sharply. "You people." He had heard it before, countless times in his life, but it never stung any less. "Look," he said, keeping his voice steady, "I don't want any trouble, but I also don't appreciate being harassed for simply existing." Blake chuckled. "Harassed? We're just doing our jobs." James met his gaze, unwavering. "Then you're not doing them very well." Officer Peterson stepped closer. "Watch your tone, old man. You don't want to make this harder for yourself." James knew what was happening. They wanted him to react, to give them a reason to escalate the situation. But he wasn't about to fall for it. Instead, he exhaled slowly and made a decision. He reached into his pocket, not for his ID, but for something far more powerful. It was time to make a call. James Whitaker wasn't just any elderly man. He had spent decades shaping young minds, mentoring future leaders, and earning the respect of powerful people across the city. And more importantly, he had connections, ones that these 2 officers had no idea about. With a calm yet firm demeanor, James pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from arrogance to mild confusion. "What do you think you're doing?" Officer Blake asked, stepping closer. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped on a contact labeled Commissioner Reynolds. He brought the phone to his ear as the officers hovered over him, still assuming they had control of the situation. "You better put that away, old man," Peterson warned. "We're not done talking to you." James ignored him. After a few rings, a deep voice answered on the other end. "James? What a surprise! How are you, my friend?" James smiled slightly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make the officers hesitate. "Commissioner Reynolds, I apologize for calling so late, but I have a situation here that I think might interest you." On the other end, the police commissioner, one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the city, fell silent for a moment. Then, his tone became serious. "Tell me everything." James kept his gaze locked on the 2 officers as he spoke. "I'm at the park on Jefferson Street, being harassed by 2 of your officers for taking an evening walk. They claim I match a description. I assume that means I'm guilty of being old and black in public?" The commissioner exhaled sharply. "Who are the officers?" James glanced at their name tags. "Blake and Peterson." On the other end there was a pause. Then a sharp response. "Stay right where you are. I'll handle this personally." James ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. When he looked up, both officers were staring at him with a mix of doubt and nervousness. They had clearly heard enough of the conversation to realize something was wrong. "Who was that?" Blake asked, trying to maintain his tough exterior. James tilted his head slightly. "Let's just say, you'll find out soon enough." Peterson scoffed. "You think calling someone's going to get you out of this?" James smiled, but there was no humor in it. "No, officer, I think it's going to get you into something much worse." For the first time that evening, it wasn't James who looked worried. It was them. A tense silence hung in the air as James Whitaker stood calmly, watching the two officers process what had just happened. Blake's confidence faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with an aggressive stance. "You think one phone call changes anything?" Blake scoffed. "We're the law out here. No one's coming to save you." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Son, you really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just let him go. This doesn't feel right." Blake shot him an irritated glare. "Are you serious? If we let him go now, it'll look like we did something wrong." Before Peterson could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet night air. The officers stiffened as multiple squad cars turned onto the street, red and blue lights flashing. The vehicles came to a screeching halt near the park entrance. James didn't flinch. He simply folded his arms and waited. Blake, on the other hand, cursed under his breath. What the hell? One of the car doors swung open, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable. It was Commissioner Reynolds. Blake and Peterson exchanged glances. They had expected backup, but not from the top of the department. The commissioner walked toward James first, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right, James?" James gave a small nod. "I'm fine, but I can't say the same for these two." He motioned toward Blake and Peterson, who now stood frozen in place. Commissioner Reynolds turned his attention to them, his face hardening. "Names?" James didn't hesitate. "Blake and Peterson." The commissioner's jaw tightened. He turned to the nearest squad car. "Captain Harris, take these two off duty immediately." Blake's face drained of color. "Wait, what? Sir, we were just doing our job." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "Harassing an elderly man in a public park without cause? Is that what you call your job?" Peterson, sensing the severity of the situation, stammered. We thought he was a suspect. We had no idea." "You had no idea that you were harassing one of the most respected men in this city?" Reynolds snapped. "You had no idea that you were messing with someone who helped build community programs you supposedly protect?" James simply watched as the officers squirmed under the weight of their mistake. Reynolds turned back to Captain Harris. "Escort them back to headquarters. Their badges are suspended until further notice." Blake clenched his fists. "Sir, this isn't fair." "You're right," Reynolds said coldly. "Fair would be firing you on the spot." Blake and Peterson looked at each other, panic setting in. They had underestimated the old man, and now their careers were hanging by a thread. James simply smiled. "I told you, boys, you'd find out soon enough." Blake and Peterson stood frozen as Captain Harris approached with two more officers behind him. The weight of their impending suspension settled over them like a heavy fog. "Hand over your badges and weapons," Harris ordered, his tone firm. Blake hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding. We were just trying to keep the park safe." Reynolds scoffed. "By harassing an elderly man with no cause? By throwing your weight around like bullies? You call that keeping the park safe?" Peterson, his face pale, quickly unhooked his badge and handed it over. He knew better than to argue. Blake, however, clenched his jaw. "This isn't right," he muttered as he reluctantly unfastened his badge and gun. He placed them in Harris's outstretched hands, his fingers lingering for a moment as if he might snatch them back. Reynolds turned to James. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, my friend." James nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "It's not the first time, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. But at least this time, there are consequences." Reynolds sighed. "There will be more than just consequences. This department has been struggling with officers like them for too long. It's time for real change." Blake scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, so now we're the problem? We're out here risking our lives, and the thanks we get is being humiliated in front of the whole department?" James stepped forward, looking Blake in the eye. "Risking your life and abusing your authority are two very different things, son. You had a choice tonight, and you chose wrong. Blake looked away, his jaw tight. Peterson remained silent, his shoulders slumped. Just then, a black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. The door opened, and out stepped a well-dressed woman with a sharp gaze. Attorney General Vanessa Holt. The crowd of officers murmured, and even Reynolds looked surprised. Holt was known for her zero-tolerance policy on police misconduct. If she was here, things were about to get serious. "Commissioner Reynolds," Holt greeted, her eyes scanning the scene. "I was briefed on what happened, and I came straight here." Blake swallowed hard. "Wait, why would the Attorney General be involved?" Holt turned her piercing gaze on him. "Because this isn't just about a bad decision. It's about a pattern. And as of tonight, an official investigation into your conduct, and that of any other officers involved in racial profiling, has been launched." Blake's face drained of color. Peterson looked like he might be sick. James just stood there, arms crossed, watching as the cracks in their careers deepened. A heavy silence settled over the scene as Attorney General Vanessa Holt stepped forward, her sharp gaze locked onto Blake and Peterson. The air was thick with tension, every officer present waiting to see how things would unfold. "Captain Harris," Holt said, her voice firm but measured, "I need a full report on what transpired here, including all body cam footage within the next hour." "Yes, ma'am," Harris responded, nodding. Blake, his pride still wounded, couldn't help himself. "This is ridiculous. We didn't do anything that bad, just a routine check, and now we're being treated like criminals?" Holt turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Routine check? You humiliated an innocent man, threatened him, and abused your authority. But more importantly, this isn't the first complaint against you, Officer Blake." Blake stiffened. "What do you mean?" Holt reached into the folder she had brought and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Multiple reports of excessive force, allegations of racial profiling, and now this incident caught on video, spreading across social media as we speak." Blake glanced at Peterson, whose face had gone pale. "This isn't fair," he muttered. James watched the officer squirm, but he remained calm. He had seen this before, officers thinking they were untouchable, until the truth caught up with them. Reynolds spoke up, stepping toward Holt. "What happens next?" Holt sighed. "Effective immediately, Officers Blake and Peterson are suspended pending a full investigation. If found guilty of misconduct, they will be terminated, and depending on the findings, criminal charges may follow." A gasp rippled through the crowd of officers. Blake's face turned red with anger. "You're going to ruin our careers over this?" Holt didn't blink. "No, Officer Blake, you ruined your own career the moment you decided to abuse your power." Blake opened his mouth to argue, but Peterson grabbed his arm, shaking his head. "Just stop," he muttered. "It's over." James finally spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Maybe next time, officers will think twice before mistreating people." Blake glared at him, but he had no words left to fight back. As Reynolds, Holt, and Harris discussed the next steps, James turned and walked toward his car. He had made his call, and now justice was in motion. But this was just the beginning. By the time James arrived home, his phone was blowing up with messages and notifications. The video of the incident had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Thousands of people were sharing their outrage, demanding justice for the way he had been treated. News outlets had already picked up the story. Headlines flashed across major networks. "Elderly black man harassed by cops calls a powerful ally." "Corrupt officers exposed in shocking viral video." "Attorney General steps in after police misconduct caught on camera." James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had spent his entire life dealing with injustice, but this time felt different. The world was watching. His phone rang, and he saw a familiar name on the screen, Senator David Langston. "James, my friend," Langston's deep voice came through. "I saw the footage. This is unacceptable." "I knew this day would come," James said calmly. "I just didn't expect it to be me in the spotlight." Langston sighed. "People are furious. My office has been flooded with calls demanding action. This might be the tipping point." James nodded. "It's not just about me. It's about all the others who didn't have a camera, who never got justice." "That's exactly why we need to act now," Langston said. "I want to take this beyond just punishing those officers. We need real reform, and I want you involved. James exhaled slowly. He had spent years advocating for change, but this was a whole new level. I'm listening, he said. Langston didn't hesitate. A public hearing. We expose the corruption, put pressure on the system, and force them to make changes. And you, my friend, will be at the center of it. James was silent for a moment, staring out the window. He had fought for justice before, but now he had an audience, a chance to make a real difference. Count me in, he said finally. As soon as he hung up, James knew there was no turning back. The fight had just begun. The next morning, James woke up to a flurry of emails and missed calls. His story had reached more people than he ever imagined. Community leaders, journalists, and even former police officers were speaking out, calling for an immediate investigation into the officers who had harassed him. Just as he was sipping his morning coffee, his phone rang again. This time, it was Internal Affairs. Mr. Reynolds, this is Detective Lisa Carter from the Internal Affairs Division. We'd like to meet with you regarding your complaint against Officers Miller and Davis. James smirked. I didn't file a complaint. Detective Carter hesitated. Well, sir, given the public outcry, the department has no choice but to investigate. James let that sink in. The same police force that had mistreated him was now scrambling to save face. All right, I'll meet with you, but not at the precinct. My lawyer and I will see you at his office. An hour later, James sat across from Carter and her partner, Detective Robert Hayes. His lawyer, Malcolm Green, sat beside him, taking notes. We want to get to the bottom of this, Carter said. Can you tell us exactly what happened that night? James leaned forward. You've seen the video, but I'll tell you what you didn't see. He recounted everything, the way the officers singled him out, their aggressive tone, how they escalated the situation over nothing. As he spoke, he could see Carter taking it seriously, but Hayes, he looked uncomfortable. Detective Hayes, Malcolm said suddenly, you seem uneasy. Is there something you'd like to add? Hayes shifted in his chair. I've worked with Miller before. Let's just say this isn't the first time a complaint has come up. James narrowed his eyes. So why is he still on the force? Carter exhaled sharply. That's what we intend to find out. Malcolm pressed further. Are you saying there's a pattern of misconduct? Carter and Hayes exchanged glances. Then, Carter pulled out a file and slid it across the table. These are past complaints against Officer Miller. Some were dismissed due to lack of evidence. But with your video, that changes things. James flipped through the pages. Each case told a similar story. Black men, unjustified stops, unnecessary aggression. This isn't just about me, James said, his voice firm. It's about how many others he's gotten away with mistreating. Carter nodded. Which is why we need your help to take this further. James clenched his fists. He had spent years seeing injustice brushed aside. But this time, they had proof. This time, something had to change, and he would make sure of it. James sat in silence, staring at the documents in front of him. Officer Miller had been accused of misconduct multiple times, yet he was still on the force. Why? Malcolm Green flipped through the pages, his lawyer instincts kicking in. This isn't just a bad cop. This is a pattern, and someone's been covering for him. Detective Carter leaned in. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. Every complaint against Miller was either dismissed or buried in paperwork. But your case is different. The public is watching. James shook his head. So, if I hadn't recorded that video, this would have been swept under the rug like the rest? Carter sighed. I won't lie to you, Mr. Reynolds. Without evidence, these cases rarely go anywhere. But now, we have something solid. Just then, Detective Hayes spoke up. And it's not just Miller. His partner, Officer Davis, has a history too. Verbal abuse, excessive force complaints, none of them ever reached the public. James clenched his jaw. So you're telling me these guys have been terrorizing people for years and nobody did anything? Carter looked away. It's more complicated than that. Malcolm scoffed. No, it's not. It's corruption. Someone high up has been protecting them. A tense silence filled the room. Then James spoke. I want to take this further, not just against Miller and Davis, but whoever's been covering for them. Carter exhaled. That's not going to be easy. James leaned forward. I don't care if it's easy. I care if it's right. Hayes hesitated before saying, You might be onto something. There's one name that keeps popping up whenever these complaints get dismissed, Captain Rogers. James narrowed his eyes. Who is he? Carter hesitated. He's Miller's superior, and he's got connections all the way to the top. James crossed his arms. Then I guess it's time we start shaking the top. The fight wasn't just about two crooked cops anymore. It was about exposing the whole system. James Reynolds sat at his kitchen table, staring at the files spread before him. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him. This wasn't just about Officer Miller and Davis. It was about an entire system that had been protecting them. Malcolm Green took a deep breath. If we go after Captain Rogers, we're making enemies. Big ones. James didn't hesitate. I've faced bigger enemies before. I won't let this slide. Detective Carter, sitting across from them, nodded. We need a strategy. If we go public without enough evidence, Rogers will shut it down before it even starts. Malcolm tapped the stack of papers. We have complaints, but complaints alone won't take him down. We need undeniable proof. Carter's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and frowned. That might be easier than you think. He put the call on speaker. Hayes, you're live. What do you got? Detective Hayes' voice came through. I did some digging. Rogers didn't just dismiss complaints. He rewrote reports, silenced witnesses, and even threatened officers who spoke up. James's fists clenched. And there's proof? Hayes continued. Yeah, I found an officer who left the force after being threatened. She's willing to talk. Malcolm's eyes lit up. That's what we need, a first-hand account. Carter stood. Let's go see her. A risky move. An hour later, they arrived at a small suburban home. The woman who answered the door looked nervous, but determined. Officer Simmons? Carter asked. She nodded. I should have come forward years ago, but I was scared. Captain Rogers is dangerous. James stepped forward. Not anymore. We're taking him down. She hesitated, then opened the door. Come in. I have something you need to see. As they entered, James knew they were about to uncover something even bigger than they expected. Officer Simmons led James, Malcolm, and Detective Carter into her dimly lit living room. The air was thick with tension as she locked the door behind them. I knew this day would come, she said, motioning for them to sit. I was part of the department for over a decade, but when I saw what Rogers was doing, I couldn't stay silent. She pulled out a USB drive from a drawer and set it on the table. This has everything: emails, body cam footage, audio recordings. I made copies before I left. Rogers thought he erased everything, but I kept the originals. Malcolm leaned forward. You're telling me you have evidence of a cover-up? Simmons nodded. And more. Rogers wasn't just protecting corrupt cops. He was taking bribes from local businesses, interfering with investigations, and even planting evidence to frame innocent people. James clenched his fists. This isn't just police misconduct. This is a criminal empire. Detective Carter picked up the USB drive carefully. If this is real, we can't just take it to the department. Rogers still has people on the inside. Simmons' expression darkened. He does, and if he finds out I gave you this, I'm as good as dead. James met her gaze. We'll protect you, but we need to make sure this goes public the right way. Carter exhaled. We need a plan. A dangerous proposition. James pulled out his phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. Governor Wallace speaking. James didn't waste time. This is James Reynolds. I have something you need to see. Something that could shake the entire police department to its core. There was a pause. Then the governor responded. Meet me at my office. Tonight. James hung up and turned to the others. We're taking this to the top, but we need to move fast. If Rogers gets wind of this, Simmons swallowed hard. He won't just come after me, he'll come after all of you. Malcolm cracked his knuckles. Let him try. James gave him a nod. Time to bring the truth to light. James, Malcolm, Detective Carter, and Officer Simmons drove in silence toward the state capitol. The USB drive containing the damning evidence against Chief Rogers rested securely in James's pocket. The weight of the moment pressed down on them. This wasn't just about clearing James's name. This was about exposing a corrupt system. As they approached the governor's office, Carter glanced at the rearview mirror. A black SUV had been tailing them for the last 10 minutes. We're being followed, he muttered. Simmons turned pale. Rogers must have found out. James clenched his jaw. We need to lose them before we reach the governor's office. Carter took a sharp right turn, speeding down a narrow alley. The SUV followed. Suddenly, Another car appeared from the opposite direction, blocking their path. "We're trapped," Malcolm said, scanning the surroundings. The doors of the SUV flew open, and three men in dark suits stepped out, guns drawn. Simmons gasped. Rogers sent his enforcers. James tightened his grip on the evidence. "They can't stop the truth." One of the men stepped forward, his voice cold. "Hand over the drive, and we'll pretend this never happened." Malcolm scoffed. "Yeah? And if we don't," the man smirked, "then none of you make it to that meeting alive." A risky gamble. Carter reached into his coat, gripping his badge. "I'm still a detective. You think you can kill us in the middle of the city without consequences?" The enforcer chuckled. "You really think Rogers hasn't covered all his bases?" James took a deep breath. This was a gamble. He slowly pulled out his phone, making sure they could see the screen. "I already sent the files to multiple people," he bluffed. "If we don't check in within 30 minutes, it all goes public." The lead enforcer hesitated. His smirk faded. Uncertainty flickered in his eyes. James pressed on. "You can shoot us now, but that won't stop what's coming. Walk away, and maybe you save yourselves from the fallout." The men exchanged glances. Then, after a tense pause, they lowered their weapons. "Let's go," one of them muttered, retreating back to the SUV. As the cars sped off, Malcolm exhaled. "That was close." James smirked. "Now let's make sure Rogers goes down for good." With renewed determination, they continued toward the governor's office. James, Malcolm, Detective Carter, and Officer Simmons rushed into the state capitol building, their nerves on edge after the ambush. The grand halls of power loomed around them, but James had no time to admire the architecture. Their goal was clear: expose Chief Rogers and bring justice. A secretary looked up as they entered. "Do you have an appointment?" Detective Carter flashed his badge. "Detective Marcus Carter. We need to see the governor immediately. It's urgent." The secretary hesitated, but, seeing the intensity in Carter's eyes, picked up the phone. "Governor Davis, there are some people here claiming it's an emergency." After a brief pause, she nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll send them in." She motioned to a set of double doors. "Go ahead." James took a deep breath. This was it. Laying it all out. Governor Davis, a middle-aged man with sharp blue eyes, sat behind his massive desk. He raised an eyebrow as they entered. "I hope this is truly urgent," Carter stepped forward. "Sir, we have evidence of deep corruption within the police department. Chief Rogers is at the center of it." James pulled out the USB drive and placed it on the desk. "This contains proof, body cam footage, audio recordings, and financial transactions linking Rogers to illegal activities." Governor Davis picked up the drive, looking skeptical. "And how do I know this isn't fabricated?" James met his gaze. "Because if it were, would we have risked our lives to bring it to you?" Malcolm added, "We were followed on our way here. Rogers has people trying to silence us." Davis exhaled slowly, then plugged the USB into his computer. As the files loaded, his expression darkened. The screen played footage of Rogers ordering officers to target specific individuals, arranging bribes, and even instructing them to cover up illegal arrests. It was undeniable. After a few minutes, the governor leaned back. "This is serious. If this gets out, it will shake the entire city." James crossed his arms. "It needs to get out." Davis nodded. "I'll have the state attorney review this immediately. Rogers won't see this coming." A sense of relief washed over James, but he knew it wasn't over yet. The fight had just begun. Governor Davis sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the evidence before him. James, Malcolm, Detective Carter, and Officer Simmons watched him closely, waiting for his decision. Finally, the governor straightened in his chair. "This is bigger than I expected. Chief Rogers is deeply embedded in this system. If we take him down, we have to do it right." James leaned forward. "How do we start?" Davis pressed a button on his phone. "Get the state attorney in here now. We have a crisis." The pressure mounts. Within minutes, the state attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Evelyn Martinez, entered the office. Her eyes scanned the room before settling on Governor Davis. "What's this about?" Davis handed her the USB drive. "Watch." As she clicked through the files, her face hardened. "This is damning." She turned to James. "How did you get this?" James exchanged a glance with Malcolm. "It wasn't easy, but the people who helped us risked their lives to expose the truth." Evelyn took a deep breath. "All right. We need to move carefully. If Rogers suspects anything, he could cover his tracks, or worse." Detective Carter nodded. He already tried to silence us once. We barely made it here. Davis clenched his jaw. Then we don't give him a chance to escape. Martinez, I want an arrest warrant drafted immediately. No leaks. We do this by the book. The leak, but before they could proceed, Davis's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, and his face went pale. He hung up and turned to the group. Someone tipped Rogers off. He just left headquarters, and we don't know where he's going. James felt his heart race. Rogers was on the run. They had to catch him before it was too late. The room erupted into action. Governor Davis barked orders to his aides, while Evelyn Martinez immediately contacted federal authorities. James turned to Detective Carter. We can't let Rogers disappear. He knows too much. If he gets away, all of this will be for nothing. Malcolm clenched his fists. He's desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. Officer Simmons' radio crackled. All units be advised. Chief Rogers' vehicle was last seen heading south on I-95. Possible armed suspect. Proceed with caution. Carter wasted no time. We need to move. A desperate chase. James, Malcolm, Carter, and Simmons jumped into an unmarked car and sped onto the highway. The air was thick with tension as they weaved through traffic, the police scanner buzzing with updates. Where would he go? James wondered aloud. Somewhere he feels safe, Carter replied, or someone who can help him escape. Simmons, focused on the road, suddenly pointed ahead. There! Black SUV, same plate number. Rogers was driving recklessly, swerving between cars. Carter grabbed the radio. Dispatch, we have eyes on the suspect. Engaging pursuit. No way out. Rogers must have realized he was being followed. He floored the gas pedal, pushing his SUV to its limit. But up ahead, flashing lights. A police blockade. Simmons smirked. Looks like his own officers don't have his back anymore. Rogers slammed on the brakes. The SUV skidded to a stop. Armed officers surrounded him. Step out with your hands up! For a moment, Rogers hesitated. His mind raced. Then slowly, he opened the door and raised his hands. The hunt was over, but James knew the real fight was just beginning. Rogers stood frozen as officers closed in, their weapons drawn. The once powerful police chief who had terrorized so many was now just another criminal facing the consequences of his actions. His face, once full of arrogance, was drained of color. James stepped forward, his eyes locked on Rogers. It's over. You don't get to run from this. Rogers sneered, trying to hold on to whatever dignity he had left. You think this changes anything? Before James could respond, 2 FBI agents pushed through the officers. Chief Rogers, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents read him his rights, James glanced at Malcolm. His father's fight for justice had come full circle. The weight of years of abuse and oppression was finally being lifted. A community stands together. News of Rogers' arrest spread like wildfire. The very community he had oppressed for years gathered outside the station, watching as he was led inside in handcuffs. Reporters scrambled for comments. One journalist turned to Malcolm. How do you feel seeing this today? Malcolm took a deep breath. This isn't just about one man. It's about the system that let him thrive. Today, we took a step toward fixing that. James added, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure this never happens again. The governor addressed the crowd. This city belongs to its people. We will rebuild trust, and we will ensure no officer abuses their power again. A new beginning. Later that night, James and Malcolm stood outside their father's old house. The sky was clear, the city quiet. Malcolm smiled. He would have been proud, huh? James nodded. Yeah, but we're not done yet. As they walked away, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows behind them. But this time, the shadows didn't feel so heavy. Justice had been served, and a new era was just beginning. If you were inspired by this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment your thoughts. Justice prevails when we stand together. Let's keep the conversation going. Subscribe for more powerful stories that need to be heard.